Capitalism transforms everything. It transforms not just simply how people work with the division of labor, descaling of labor. It also transforms the complicated web of financial intermediation that had existed up until this time. There is, in other words, a highly, increasingly sophisticated system of intermediaries that grow up, brokers, for example, who start to bring together buyers and sellers. Take, for example, this banknote from the Bank of Lexington, Kentucky, and, North Carolina. You see on the lower right an image of a man with a piece of paper looking at a cotton bale. And then you have images of slave labor on the other side. But the lower right, that's a cotton broker, someone who begins to bring together buyers and sellers of cotton for a commission. This middleman is not just simply some sort of parasitical relationship that is preying on both parties, but instead is typical of the kinds of specialization that starts to take place as trade and commerce becomes increasingly complex, increasingly driven by market forces, and increasingly requiring that whoever stands in these various stages of the web of a series of transactions has to be able to extend credit, for example, from one person to another. Other brokers ensure deals in the buying and selling of wheat, of hogs in the West, pigs, and similarly, there are intermediaries that start to operate between, say, the people who import the goods and the people who ultimately retail them. Now there are these folks, they're called jobbers. You can see one is here, who are like the middlemen who stand between what had previously been a fairly simple relationship between the importer and the ultimate seller of goods. There's a similar specialization that's taking place on retail, where you start to see differentiation in retail from one place to another, and the development of new forms of retail that had not yet been seen. This is Alexander T. Stewart, who developed what is considered kind of first proto-department store. A form of shopping, by the way, that is almost extinct today. The idea that like you walk into a department store and it has different departments, hence the name, and you could do all of your shopping for, say, clothing or housewares all in one place. Well, this is a concept introduced at this time, and it was one that actually was more efficient than what had previously been the case, where people had to go to many different places for their goods. Similarly, in offices, you begin to see the kinds of hierarchies developing that, we associate, for those of you who grew up watching The Office, and the workers at Dunder Mifflin, a paper intermediary that's kind of distributing paper in Pennsylvania. Well, that kind of need for an office staff is increasingly typical of these very, very complicated organizations that are starting to operate and mediate between multiple different institutions within the larger economy. It requires a staff that has to do immense amounts of incredibly boring work. This is an age before copy machines, for example. And so there's a lot of people who work as scriveners. Their only job is simply to copy documents, most often legal documents, or keep track of various things. But these are increasingly complicated, hierarchical, layered organizations. And here we have the Walton Watch Company again. For workers in these environments, what we would call today the white-collar workers, the middle-class workers who are in these places, This is, you start to see the advent of salaried jobs and a kind of feeling that a lot of these jobs are dead end. In other words, you can certainly live comfortably on them, but you're not going to go places. You're not going to be a dynamic entrepreneur. And just as much as work for the middle classes is being reoriented, work for the working classes is also being radically transformed at this time. We've already talked about labor in the Industrial Revolution in some depth, the mill girls of Lowell, the people who replaced them, and especially after the Panic of 1837 and the resultant downturn. In the years subsequent to that, there was increasing cost pressure, both to compete internationally with the British, but also within the United States, factories and factory owners competing with one another. And most factory owners and managers resorted to three methods of extracting more labor for less money out of their workers. And they did so, for example, by the so-called stretch out, the speed up, and the premium system. I just want to explain those three because they're kind of central to any future labor disputes after this point. The stretch out is the idea that you're going to make any given worker cover more than what they had previously covered. So if a woman is working on the textile factory floor, they now have to just tend more machines, okay? They have to do more and cover more that had previously been covered by other individuals. The speed up is fairly obvious. It's actually speeding up the machines or speeding up the assembly line much later. We don't have the assembly line at this time. And then there's the premium system, which is simply the idea that you incentivize workers to be more productive so that you can, and the way you do this is typically to give managers a financial benefit that the workers rarely get it, but the managers get it if they can somehow persuade the workers to be more productive and to do more with less. So in Lowell, Massachusetts, to give you an example of how the three systems work, between 1836 and 1850, there's an increase in the number of spindles and looms of about 150%. So like the actual machines are growing, but the number of workers is only growing by 50%. And so these are all functions of this kind of new efficiency. The women who were in these positions, and the men as well, and any number of other positions, increasingly resort to labor strikes and labor activism to push for shorter working days, better wages, and there is a growth of radicalism among the working classes, especially in the 1840s, when you see the arrival of Irish immigrants en masse, many of whom undercut the workers who were native born and who were used to making more money. And so you begin to see, for example, these kinds of songs and sentiments expressed by workers, in this case, a song composed by the Lowell Mill Girls, lamenting their fate as factory workers and likening themselves, a little erroneously, I should add, to slaves. For many people in the working class, and there are growing numbers at this time who are flooding into cities, taking up manual labor of various kinds. This is both at times a source of pride and at the same time, especially if they were working in skilled positions. But for many, it was also a cutthroat dog-eat-dog world where the actual supply of work itself would ebb and flow, putting people perilously close to poverty or well below poverty. In other cases, the dangers of the work. For example, these men working in an iron foundry, they are not equipped with the latest, greatest safety equipment, as this photo would attest. These individuals are working very high-risk jobs. Nonetheless, there is a growing sense of despite the very disparate forms of work that people were doing, there is a growing emergence of what we would describe today as a kind of working class culture and working class consciousness, that people were the laboring classes, and that they worked for they were working for money, oftentimes extraordinarily hard, and they were quote productive members of society. This feeling of being both underpaid but also doing the work that kept the country moving would eventually burst into more concerted forms of labor activism, especially after the Civil War, when they launched a lot of national union movements, national labor movements that tried to critique what they deemed to be the unproductive classes, people like lawyers, bankers, and others who did not contribute in the same way to society. Here's a final point about the transformation of labor for many of these people. This is, again, takes you back to the Lowell Mills and shows you the regimentation of life that was increasingly representative of life in a factory. That there were bells that got people up, you had to be there on time, you worked a set number of days, there were only certain breaks at certain times, and then you were done. And this is what historians have sometimes described as time work discipline, as a hallmark of labor in a capitalist society, that this is what differentiates it from the kind of manual labor that was the norm in the previous century, when people maybe didn't get to work every day at precisely the same time. And maybe they didn't work some days. There was a lot more flexibility built into the system. There was no flexibility in a factory in which those working class, those watches I showed you are increasingly the thing that dominates the existence of the laborers. All right. I mentioned that Irish immigrants and certainly groups from all around other parts of Europe to a lesser extent are increasingly going to drive many individuals into opposition to immigrants. In other words, the kind of upsurge in anti-immigrant sentiment that you've seen last decade or so in the United States is hardly a new thing. This is an Irish immigrant who is being celebrated here, but in fact, this time it was much more common, and we'll talk about this in greater length, for immigrants to be the focus of intense hatred, in some cases violence at this time.